So up there, we are pretty far outside of where a lot of the drainage research has happened in the past. And so that's what a big focus of my work is there. We definitely did lose nitrogen that year, but it was a soybean year. And it wasn't as much as I thought it would be, to be honest. We're looking at what was volatilizing, and the volatilization losses were greater than our tile drainage losses. When the lift stations were on and when they were off, you actually are getting water table control with a lift station.
Welcome to the Water Table. Trey Allis here, joined today with Lindsay Pease, the Associate Professor and Extension Specialist at University of Minnesota Crookston. So, Lindsay, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, and like you mentioned, I'm a faculty member at University of Minnesota, and I work all the way up as far north as you can. Well, not quite as far north as you can, but almost getting close. At the Northwest Research and Outreach Center, which is in Crookston. And so up there, we are pretty far outside of where a lot of the drainage research has happened in the past. And so that's what a big focus of my work is there. But then also, I'm also looking at aspects of nutrient management and soil health and how all of those things integrate into one system.
Yeah, awesome. And I want to dive into that a lot here. And I know you have a lot of good research and stuff that's going to be coming out and some events and stuff there too. But want to talk a little bit about your background a little bit. So you're not from Crookston originally, but where are you from, and kind of talk about your path getting up to where you're at now.
Yeah, so originally, not from Minnesota at all. This was not necessarily on my list of things that I thought I would end up in my life, but super excited and happy that it worked out this way. But I grew up in Northwest Ohio, in the western Lake Erie basin, which is another flat glacial lake bed. So there is at least a connection there. When I went to college, I went off to Ohio State. I was an agricultural engineering student there. Actually, all my degrees are in agricultural engineering. For my first summer job, I worked with Dr. Larry Brown, who was a drainage engineer there at Ohio State. And that summer, I just learned a lot just about agriculture in general and got, kind of my first look at drainage research. It was like, well, this is kind of cool and interesting. At that time, they were focusing a lot on controlled drainage and kind of looking at those impacts on yield. And I just thought this was such a cool way of managing your drainage. And so I got my first taste of this kind of conservation drainage that summer. We drove all around Northwest Ohio to these different sites. And I also got a chance to interact with the farmers a lot and really got to understand, how important the drainage is as part of the operation and how it's really needed, which, coming from the suburbs is not something that you ever think about.
Sure.
Of course, we all think about sump pumps and, ditches full of water. Northwest Ohio certainly has its share of water, especially moving, all times of the year. But didn't think about how the farmers deal with that. So that really got me interested. And then I got opportunities, I think Dr. Brown was the first one to suggest to me going to graduate school. I did my master's and stayed on for my PhD and just getting deeper and deeper into drainage. And then so when the opportunity came up, there was a faculty position open, the one I currently have at University of Minnesota. I went up and I toured, it was like below zero, middle of February, of course.
Yep.
But there was something about that landscape, that flat glacial landscape that I was like, well, this looks familiar. And, and it's been great. This has been all the different challenges of, farming in Northwest Minnesota and the complex rotations, way more complicated than any other place
Right.
In, I think, the whole country. But I think it's been an exciting place to work.
Yeah. And when did you start up there?
Yeah. So I started in 2018. So the summer of 2018. So it's been about 7 years. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure time flies. Sure, with a lot of that stuff too. You mentioned some of the things with the Red River Valley. I want to talk about some of the other kind of uniquenesses that's going on there. Not just that the water goes north, but like I said, flat, different rotations. Talk through some of that stuff.
Yeah. So I think the big thing is the diversity of the crop rotations that we still have in Northwest Minnesota. Obviously, not everybody grows sugar beets, but if you do grow sugar beets, that is a major part of your rotation and taking care of those beets, to produce sugar. And so that is kind of one aspect that's completely different. I would also say, lots of people having spring wheat in the rotations. Still, a lot of other parts of the country, the wheat has gone out of rotations. And so thinking about, these systems. I think from a nutrient management standpoint, those two crops in particular are really interesting because you are trying to target the nitrogen rates, pretty bang on
Okay.
to what they need, which is different than for corn, which you usually like. Well, you just try to get it. I mean, of course, with the commodity prices and,
Right.
the nitrogen prices, you don't want to overdo it too much, but there's less of a penalty. But especially for beets and for wheat, there's really a penalty.
For having too much
For going too
nitrogen.
much.
And
Yeah.
so, I mean, like, and we'll get into that a little bit more too, but from a water quality standpoint, then is there's just going to be less available to leach out through those systems. Is that right?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what we were interested in finding out. With these different crops in the rotation, we really have no data on, what's moving through the system. How are these nutrients cycling differently, with these different crops, especially, something like sugar beets, the root goes really super deep and they regularly soil down to 4 feet to make sure they get, all the nutrients, accounted for that the
Mhm.
beet could potentially take up. So yeah, no, it is something that for sure interacts with the drainage, and what is available to leach. Yeah.
Sure. And obviously it's a lot colder up there. Different precipitation and stuff like that too. Is there any other kind of reasons why there is that more aggressive crop rotation up in that neck of the woods?
Yeah, I am not I guess I'm not 100% sure why, that crop rotation has persisted. I think it's some of it is just, the corn has been a little slower to move northward. It's definitely moving in, but there's still a lot of, local processing left, especially for the sugar and markets for the wheat. And so they're sticking around. So I think it's really just kind of a market reason.
Right.
Yeah, but I think one of the reasons why the sugar beets have persisted is actually because of our cold climate, because they store all of those beets outside all winter long,
Mhm.
and so if we didn't get as cold as we did, they would not have the room for the storage of the beets, and that the beet harvest that they do in October lasts them all the way until May. So
Right.
yeah, that's I think a big factor, at least for the sugar beets.
Yeah, and kinda as it gets into, some of your research and your plots there too, it's kinda interesting to pull out some of those different, different rotations on how that affects the water quality and the yields and, you changed, I guess, a lot of variables compared to a lot of the stuff that's researched down in, Iowa, Illinois, heavy corn, soybean rotations and whatnot, so there's different aspects in play there, but that's kinda, I assume, some of the fun and some of the interesting
Absolutely.
parts there too.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a big reason why I think it's interesting, also, and you mentioned the weather patterns. I mean, mostly all of our moisture, a lot of our moisture comes from the snowmelt in the spring. And so you have to deal with that. But also, you don't want to get rid of all your moisture for the year. So this is a really big challenge and something that we have experienced a couple of times where, you get the snowmelt and then no more rain for the rest of the year, or maybe when you do get way too much rain, it's really hard to deal with. And so that's where actually I do think that drainage is a really good tool for the soils and for the climate and for helping kind of maintain that soil moisture profile. It's good for the crop.
Yeah, for sure. Being able to have utilize the moisture that is there,
Yes.
where it's not drowned out, and you still have the ability for crops to access some of that too, and having more oxygen in the soil. All of those things that you're well familiar with. Um, Question on kind of getting into your main site. Give a little high level overview on some of that. How to start.
Yeah, of course. So, given how far north I am, I do like to call these plots as Minnesota's coolest drainage plots, by annual average temperature, of course. But I think they're pretty cool too. And we started this site really, really soon after I started my job. We mentioned earlier I started in 2018. And these plots went in the fall of 2019. So that was a pretty quick turnaround. I was like, I really want to get a large scale drainage project. And what's different about these plots than some other plots that are in Minnesota is this is a whole field scale experiment. We have a 60-acre field that we are working with, and we farm this at the research center. So we have our own, crew that goes out with their full size, tractors, combines, all the works. And so we farm this whole 60 acres as one unit, and we alternate sections of 15 acres with the laterals run, 15 acres without, 15 with, and 15 without. So we're alternating drained and undrained as we go across. And this has allowed us to kind of look at the water quality at the site. We are monitoring. We have a lift station for the tile. We also have a lift station for our surface runoff, which is a feature of the research that we have 2 lift stations. You could just get away with one, and that was a fairly big expense, but it has been great for making sure that those water streams stay separate. So we actually get a good look at what's the water quality in the tile versus what's in the surface runoff.
So you can have that direct comparison on those acres, undrained acres, drained acres, water coming out of the tile, water coming off for runoff.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is kind of a great way to look at, the overall, again, the big picture. And on this field, it started out, the first couple years is soybean wheat rotation. And then in 2024, we did sugar beets. And 2025, we went back to wheat. So we haven't gotten corn out there yet. But it is, I think, in the future of that site.
Mhm.
But yeah, we mostly have kind of that wheat, soybeans, and sugar beets that we have taken a look at so far. Yeah.
Sure. And you have some of that kind of data coming through. And can you talk about some of the results that you've seen, or maybe talk about some of the weather patterns that
Yeah.
you've had to deal with throughout those years?
Yeah, for sure. And again, this is one of those, amazing timing things is that the very first summer that we had this installed, like I mentioned, it was fall 2019, this went in. It was a fairly wet fall, and then it was followed by the wettest growing season that we have had on record, since this project went in. And it was really great that we actually got to capture that
Hmm.
as part of our data analysis. So back in 2020, we had over 7 inches of rain in July, which, when you think about normally we only get about 20 for the entire year, this was huge. And this was on soybeans. And so, I have a lot of pictures from that year, and the soybeans just were drowned out in the undrained sections. They looked terrible. And really the drainage in the plots, that's what saved our crop that year, because we averaged about 40 in the drained sections and 37. So it's a three bushel per acre loss in our undrained section. But yeah, they just literally looked beat up,
Look pretty out. Yeah.
looked pretty rough. And then so that year we got some of our best, data collection and some of our, most leaching. Through the tile, we definitely got a lot of water moving. But one outcome of that I think has been really interesting as I've been going back and looking at that data, and we definitely did lose nitrogen that year, but it was a soybean year.
Hmm.
And it wasn't as much as I thought it would be, to be honest. Really, I think we were also during that year, we were looking at what was volatilizing, and the volatilization losses were greater than our tile drainage losses. If
Sure.
you look at it,
Just
full
that
nitrogen,
soil sitting full of water with no oxygen. It's just losing that.
it's losing
Yeah.
that to the
Yep.
air. Yeah, so it's a totally invisible pathway that we don't always think about, when we're losing nitrogen. And so, yeah, even though we had the tile there, even though the tiles were running all summer long, really, from a dollar perspective, with the current nitrogen prices, it's about $3 per acre, which is not insignificant, but it was less than I thought it would be. About
Sure.
a pound per acre is what we lost. So this again, I think that's actually kind of a good story of if that's our worst case scenario and that's what nitrogen we're losing in the Northwest, I think that's actually a great
Right.
outcome. It's a great story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not compared, like I mentioned, to some of the other climates, geographies, and soils. I'm very sure has a lot to do with it. In other areas too, where yeah, a couple pounds, couple
Yeah.
dollars here and there, and not make or break it. But yeah, seeing those differences within that is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and then the year after that, we went into the most extreme drought that we've had. So those first 2 years really were a tale of two extremes. And one being, as wet as possible, and the next is just like somebody turned the water off. And really, again, we sort of saw a similar story of, well, in that year the tile drains didn't run at all. But
Mhm.
what I think is a really important outcome out of that year is a question that I still get asked, which because tile is a little bit more new in the Northwest and a little bit more rare, is will tile drainage over drain my soil? And I think with the 2021 drought, we can pretty definitively say, no, it didn't over drain the soil. We had no soil moisture
Right.
everywhere. So
Yeah, and that was a question that we get into, or that I get asked sometimes, or there's that belief out there for tile in a drought can help you sometimes, and this is going to be a question to you that I get, and it might have perspective on it. It's all anecdotal, but from a researcher, tile in a drought, that's the theory out there. As long as you have some moisture in the soil, that those roots are going to go down and find it, and be a little more robust for when you do have some rain coming in later in throughout the summer. Obviously, if you don't have rain, you kind of screwed a little bit, but is that something that you found with that? And did those drain plots still outperform the undrained plots in those droughts?
Yeah, so I think what we saw is pretty even performance
Mhm.
during the droughts. And one of the reasons for that is actually, I think, more due to the installation conditions than actually due to the tile drainage themselves, because we also have some other older drainage plots and have seen really, no effect, no effect of, the tile being present, on the yields. But what we did see, especially during that first drought, is I think we saw a lot of the compaction that we caused from the wet fall and the wet installation, and
Mhm.
some of that soil is still rebounding. So we had kind of even and maybe slightly lower yields. But again, looking at the soil moisture and the moisture availability and the way that the crop developed, I don't think it was from the soil moisture.
Right,
I
it
think
wasn't necessarily moisture related, more
it was
kind of
more
compaction.
compaction related. Yes.
What about the last, say, last couple years, for some of the data that you're seeing now? You're rotating through, like you said, uh, soybeans, wheat,
And sugar beets. Yeah.
and it sprinkling in some sugar beets now too.
Yeah, so the sugar beets we had in 2024, and really I think the beets benefited a lot from the tile as well. It didn't come out so much in the final yields that we got, but especially during pre-pile, those beets were ahead. We were better on rain, but still a little bit short on rain. And I think that, yeah, that we really saw the tile, helping those beets get off to a better start, better stand establishment, and then, and then kind of a better produced beets, a better higher quality beets in the drainage section
Mhm.
once we actually went to harvest. And so that was a really good story. That we did have a bit of some rain in between pre-pile and the final harvest that allowed, I think, those undrained beets to catch up a little
Sure.
bit. But we actually do also have, kind of looking across, we grew beets somewhere else, and some drained and undrained parts of the farm that year too. And when you look at the two sites together, we did have better sugar content, and so actually higher quality beets on the
Sure.
drained section than the undrained section, which again is good news both from a yield perspective, what you're taking home at the end of the day, but also from a water quality perspective, because that means that the beets were using that nitrogen that was available to them in a really efficient way,
Mhm.
putting on the sugar that you want them to be putting on and not just putting on size. And so that was a great outcome.
Right. Essentially given the opportunity for the crop to live up to that potential that, that you're putting in your inputs for, that you're doing, all the work in the field, and all that too. And I assume timeliness has played a little bit of a role in there too.
Yes.
I know that's something on some previous plots, maybe, where it was kind of, well, we have to wait for all of it to get ready to whatever, to till or spray or plant, whatever, all at the same time. Is that something that you guys were doing on your plots as well? Is kind of waiting for that whole field, or did you kind of do it up separately?
Yeah,
And undrained.
that is kind of one of the downsides of having these kind of split plots is we do wait until the whole field is ready to be able to, plant or do those operations. So yeah, we don't necessarily have that benefit of, maybe 1 to 2 extra days, which is something else that, we can see when we look at the temperature data and we look at the moisture data. The drainage sections are ready, a couple days before, and especially when you have such a short growing season, every single day is important. And so I do think that that's a benefit that maybe with the current design we're not able to get at quite as much.
Mhm.
But I will say anecdotally, the guys who farm it do think that even without the whole field being tiled, they are able to get into that field a little bit sooner than they would have otherwise. And so
Sure.
again, this is one of those, it's a real world experiment. And so we don't have, plastic barriers or
Right.
anything keeping the water moving from the undrained section to the drained section. And so I do think there is a little bit of water movement, slow water movement from the undrained sections is probably making the whole field a little bit drier.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And easier to yeah, do some of those operations as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, like I said, it's hard to account for all of this stuff in one site. But again, it's cool. And I appreciate you being able to talk through, some of these nuances, some of the other kind of little things that are out there for, how this is going to impact farmers and some of those decisions. Some of the, like I said, some of the questions that I get a lot
Yeah.
are some of the perspectives that are out there as well, to kind of see if that matches up with the numbers that you guys are getting too.
For sure. Yeah.
Um, you mentioned some of the water quality stuff a little bit, and I'm kind of curious. So we're talking about nitrogen and some of the leaching and being the crop being able to utilize it. Talk about some of the runoff, and some of the phosphorus and whatnot. I know that's a bigger issue up in the valley where water goes north up to Winnipeg and some of those challenges with that. Can you talk about some of those results or what you've been finding in that realm?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the phosphorus questions and the runoff questions, especially coming from another, phosphorus impacted watershed, Western Lake Erie Basin, which anybody who has heard about water quality probably knows about. In Chesapeake Bay is the same way. So there's some really heavily affected phosphorus watersheds, and so again, these questions hadn't been answered for the Red River Basin and what our conditions are and what we're experiencing. And one of the big things that I've really seen and confirmed on our plots is that the tile water comes off with a lower phosphorus concentration than the surface runoff. And so actually having the tile out there, particularly in the summer and the fall months, are going to actually lower some of our phosphorus runoff because that opportunity for the water to infiltrate into the soil and be filtered out a little bit, that phosphorus is, I like to call it sticky, it sticks to the soil. So if you have the opportunity for that phosphorus to move into the soil profile, it's probably going to stick there. It's probably going to stay there. But you do really run into trouble when you have a lot of water moving across the surface. But one of the differences I would say that the Red River Basin has as compared to other places in the U.S., again, relates to the cold climate. We usually freeze so deep in the winter that a lot of that spring snow melt, where people would be really start to be concerned, there's a lot of soil phosphorus moving. I will say that the tiles don't get to intercept a lot of that
Hmm.
runoff. A lot of water and a lot of that big flooding isn't going to be affected by the presence or the absence of tile. And so that one is a little bit of like a, well, our bigger, we still need to do some erosion control. We still need to have some practices, on the ground surface to kind of help prevent that from happening, because the soils are frozen in between the top of the soil and the tiles. So
Right.
that is one time of the year that we don't have the opportunity for that filtering effect of the soil. And
Right, so there's not gonna be much of a impact there, like I said, even a positive one of having that, the soil be sticky and then hang on to that phosphorus. Everything's frozen there anyways, all that water's moving, and that's, again, a little bit of a different problem when you're talking, some of the nitrate things that we're looking at versus runoff now,
yeah.
where, you have practices like the buffers and, slowing that water down a little bit, let some of that stuff, the phosphorus settle out. Are there any other practices or any other strategies that are going on in the basin for combating some of those runoff problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big things for looking at the runoff are anything that kind of slows that water down. So that could be, a buffer. It could be a grass waterway. It could be, grass waterways are something that that's a total out of left field. I think we don't utilize enough especially in Northwest Minnesota. We've got a lot of swales and scrape swales that could
Hmm.
probably benefit. Um, but we also have, I think you can do cover crops and some rye on the field or even in the fall, some oats, and that stuff will winter kill, but having a little bit of residue, increasing the surface roughness, right, is something that we all learn in our engineering hydrology classes that, anything that kind of that roughs up the surface and slows the water down. Um, Trying to think about some opportunities to do less tillage in the fall,
Hmm.
because, all through the growing season, that crop actually makes a pretty nice mat. And I know that's what the tillage is for, is to, keep that mat from being there in the spring. Um, but I'm not saying don't do spring tillage. I'm saying maybe hold off on some fall tillage, if you think you can if you can, stomach it, just because, that all that crop residue actually can do a good job, holding the soil in place over the winter.
Right. And I mean, that's the reason that I asked the question is, like I said, it's a little bit different water quality problems than, what a lot of the rest of the Midwest is kind of looking at with some of that stuff too. And, just talking through some of the strategies that are out there for that. If we're worried about some of the soil moving, there's, again, these practices and, conservation practices that are there to keep that soil where it is. Yep. It's going to take a little bit of changing some minds and perspectives on, probably namely tillage. there's opportunities that are out there for solving some of these problems, or the way I always say it is tools in the toolbox. Again, whether we're talking about saturated buffers, bioreactors, other regular buffers, wetlands, storage ponds, things like that, are all kind of part of the calculus that goes in with looking at, I guess it's engineering, but part of it that goes into, looking at some of these problems and different ways to address them based on the different landscapes, different weathers, different crops, all the other things with it.
Yeah, I think something really big that I've learned, studying water quality and tile drainage, especially, is that there are some nutrient losses that you're if you're doing the absolute best that you can, there are always going to be some losses that you can't prevent or that really aren't your fault as the farmer. And I actually think that's why I really love some of these conservation drainage practices or edge of field practices like you just mentioned, because those are opportunities to put something, at the edge of your field to help catch, to help stop um, those losses that are just kind of incidental. And,
Mm.
and from an environmental perspective, even those incidental losses can add up, especially over a whole watershed or a whole, field. So yeah, that's really one of the reasons I think those practices are so great.
Yeah, and it's like I said, you're gonna take pairing a lot of that stuff there, and it's not a one size fits all by any means. But having that information out there, and again, a lot of the research that you're working on, a lot of your other colleagues as well, is putting that stuff together to put numbers to what we're seeing to help address the right things in the right spots too. And kind of another, I guess, practice looking at maybe your sites moving forward. I think you're looking into some controlled drainage and some of the opportunities that come with that through the lift stations. Can you talk about some of that a little bit?
Yes. No, that's, I think, something else that's been really exciting that we've been finding on our site is, as I mentioned, you could see a little bit of, that water movement, maybe from the undrained section to the drained section. Some of why we know that is because we've been looking at water table levels, throughout this whole 60-acre field. And we put a whole bunch of water table wells out this past summer. We finally got, rain in the summer, after 2020, when we really didn't have much the last, several years. And we could see in the water table well data when the lift stations were on and when they were off. You actually are getting water table control with a lift station,
Hmm.
which I think is really, really exciting because that means that there's a tool that, so many farmers already have installed that they could be using for controlled drainage. And what it requires then, to be able to take advantage of that is possibly, switching that lift station on and off. Maybe when you're dry, switching that lift station off. And, there's a literal switch on our lift station to make this super easy, to possibly hold back some water during times of drought. In 2021, I don't think it would have made a difference. We were that dry. But, 2022 and 2023, when we got those timely rains, if we'd possibly had the lift stations off, if we'd had a crop that can maybe withstand a little bit more moisture for a couple days, you can really start playing around with that. Controlled drainage, especially in Ohio, we've seen, it's a modest increases in yield, but those increases in yield are there when you get precipitation at the right time.
Mhm.
So I think this is a tool that would be very cool to test out, to really start quantifying, and also to then think about, again, the water quality benefits. What water quality benefits do you get from maybe turning your lift stations off in the fall, maybe a little bit sooner than you would otherwise? And if you could prevent, a little bit of tile flow in the fall, that can go sometimes a long way to, either storing water in the profile or getting that benefit of, filtering
Mhm.
from the soil and yeah, kind of playing around with those ideas some.
Concluding your hypotheses and moving that forward, for a farmer here in the future, of being able to utilize their structures for controlled drainage. What does that kind of look like?
Yeah, I think what that looks like is really, as like you mentioned, really adjusting those set limits. So there's a certain water level when the pumps kick on and a certain level when they kick off. And if you can, and just really simply by reprogramming them so that maybe, they hold on to water a little bit longer, because of course you don't, if you do get, 7 inches of rain in July, you don't want to hold all of that back. So you do still want some, safety capacity
Mm.
there, and you don't wanna risk a drown out. But you could probably push those limits a little bit more than we are, especially later in the season and when the roots are deeper, maybe the crop is more established and, again, can handle a little bit more. And, of course, this is gonna be different for the different crops we have. Soybeans may have a different tolerance than corn or for wheat or even sugar beets. So I think this is going to be really exciting to start to look at, what are the different tolerances for the crops and yeah, what are those recommendations going to be? Because, yes, it's pretty easy to say like, well, you just turn off the lift station. But then the question is, well, when do you turn it back on? What's safe and what's not? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting. So we had Scott and Josh with AgriDrain on here, maybe a month or two ago, and that's essentially they're doing some same things on gravity outlets with all
Yes.
their structures, and stair step with that through the field too. And obviously where those practices work best are on flat fields, and essentially that's what all there is up in the valley. So yeah, kind of curious on how that it's essentially already automated. There's already those set points in there. They just have to manipulate and modify and, again, kind of just putting more numbers to answering some of those questions on, okay, well, if I am growing this, when do I do X, Y, and Z at different stages for the crop or, where the roots are at and all the other things too. So that's going to be interesting to have that pan out a little bit more and put more
Yeah.
more numbers in some of those questions.
Yeah, I'm really excited, and I am interested, and of course, I'm pretty interested in thinking about how the two systems might be able to work together. The lift stations, I'm also aware of the automated controlled drainage that AgriDrain's coming out with, and thinking about, yeah, can these two systems actually work together in some ways to get parts of the field. Because our fields are even though they look flat and
Not
they look
perfectly.
similar, they have some differences. And of course, then there are also instances where a lift station may control multiple fields. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, really thinking about leveraging that to its full potential, I think is again like a really would be a really cool future extension of this work.
Yeah, for sure. I guess with that, speaking of that, what else do you have either planned for your site, or I guess maybe going back, are there any other kind of results or conclusions that you came up with for your site here in the last 5 years?
Yeah, I think overall, yeah, some of the future work that we have planned, yeah, in addition to looking at the controlled drainage, this field is in a very visible part of town, and a lot of snow blows across this field. And so we are actually, asked a lot of the time about things like snow fences and trees, just because a lot of people are driving down this field. And so there could be some future work about like, what is there anything we can do does and if we do have to put a snow fence up, at along the road, does the tile actually help, does the tile actually help dry that out a little bit quicker? I think would be one really big answer, which is a very reality, especially, as we're dealing with all this blowing snow.
Hmm.
Um, we also are looking at, with the winter between 2024 and 2025, we didn't have a lot of snow cover, and so there was a lot of blowing dirt, in Northwest Minnesota, and that I think exposed a lot of, that how much we rely on that snow cover to help keep soil in place. And so we've been playing around with could we switch to some more reduced tillage practices on this field as well, kind of putting in those erosion control practices like I mentioned earlier. What can we do? And of course, we're tracking all of those metrics like, what are we making back? What are our yields? How long is it taking to respond? And so we're kind of pushing our farm a little bit, to make those changes to hopefully answer some questions down the line. And I think that'll be a cool thing we could talk about with these plots too, especially those effective on water quality.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, be able to have you back on and talk through some of that stuff here in the future as well.
Yes, for sure.
Cool. I guess another thing that wanted to have you take the floor on a little bit is workshop coming up here later on this spring.
Yes. So this has been really exciting. Yeah, this is for many years, University of Minnesota or the state of Minnesota hasn't really had a tiling workshop. And NDSU had one for a while too, but they also have been on hiatus. So myself and Lakshmi Prasad, who's new tile extension engineer at NDSU, we decided to work together on putting together a tiling workshop for Minnesota and North Dakota. This year, it will be on March 18th in Fargo. That'll be on NDSU's campus. So look for some details on that soon. And we're just really excited, one day workshop just to start to kind of get the ball rolling again on kind of this tile education that we know that there are a lot of questions left to be answered and a lot of data like I'm sharing today that, would be really, I'm sure lots of people are curious about. And so, yeah, that's our plan for this year and hopefully expanding that to more locations in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, something that, we identified that need within our industry as well. We put on some kind of clinics. I don't want to say they're schools because they're not as in depth. But, talking through some of that stuff, from pipe installation and from layout and design and making sure you do have your bang for your buck. And also, what are those tools that are out there for conservation drainage practices and things like that, too? Wanted to mention there are a few others. Universities in the kind of in this CDN and in kind of our sphere that are working on some of the similar stuff. So I think Michigan State has their drainage school on 3 through 5 March, and then the Ohio State University is going to be later on in March. I think 16th through the 20th. And then also shameless plug is with the ADMC. We are planning a handful of webinars. That's going to cover some similar topics that kind of geared toward contractors and again revolving around these practices and installation and some of the tools that are out there here later on in February too. So there's going to be a lot more opportunity for those that are interested to come get this information. It's kind of good to have that kind of sprinkled out throughout the Midwest and different locations, and it's good to have it back and active here in Minnesota and North Dakota too.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
So awesome. Well, I think that covered a lot of stuff. I appreciate you for coming on and sharing a lot about your research and kind of your pathway here. And again, thanks for coming on. Thanks for a lot of the work that you're doing with again some of the uniqueness going on up in the Red River Valley, and like you said, putting numbers to a lot of things that are already going on out there, so we can better know what we're doing to make those improvements moving forward. So, Lindsay, thanks a lot for coming on.
Yeah, and thanks for having me.
Also appreciate your earrings.
Oh, yes, of course.
I noticed
Yes.
those about right away too.
Yeah, of course, and these are, my Prinsco
They are Prinsco pipe.
our
I can
Prinsco
tell.
pipe, yes, and the earrings, for if anybody's watching the video, I have a pair of tile drainage earrings that I wear because when we were soil sampling Minnesota's coolest drainage plots, we accidentally dropped a soil probe through one of our tile lines, because as I mentioned, we do soil sample down to a depth of about 4 feet, so we, of course, intercepted the tile. And to commemorate the event, my technician who was working with me at the time made them into a pair of earrings, which I wear anytime I am talking about tile drainage.
Perfect. That's awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah, of course.